Gaza is undergoing one of the most severe humanitarian crises in recent memory. Entire neighborhoods have been erased. More than 2 million people, half of them children, have been held under bombardment, starvation, and displacement. An estimated 70,000 or so have been confirmed dead, with thousands more likely remaining to be found in the wreckage. Food, water, electricity, all of that's been cut off for months at a time. Some call it collateral damage and necessary evil, while others call it ethnic cleansing and genocide. Either way, the scale of the suffering is undeniable, and it's happening right now in real time with the whole world watching and with the overwhelming financial, moral, and spiritual support of America and American Christians. As such, I've brought on Dr. Bruce Fisk, a New Testament scholar who did his PhD at Duke and who has published multiple works on numerous topics, including the one facing us today. Welcome, Dr. Fisk. Just to get us started, could you tell us a bit about yourself and what led you into this very enigmatic, controversial subject of Israel and Gaza?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to your program. So I began my kind of interest in this subject rather late, about 22 years ago. I was teaching at Westmont College in Southern California and began heading to Israel, Palestine, pretty much to to bolster and strengthen my own, classroom activities, my lectures. I wasn't really going with much of a political agenda, uh, but I kept going back and I began to see things. And before long, I really wanted to bring students and open their eyes, or at least allow them to see what I was seeing. And so I would find excuses to get over there, volunteering to teach English or to rebuild a house, or in one way or another to do sabbaticals and do things over there to just immerse myself, to explore, to hike around, to meet people. And, it was many of the friendships, I think, that turned my heart and head as much as anything. But I've been in some gnarly situations, things I wouldn't do today that I did years ago. Smelled lots of tear gas, helped people that had been shot, went through a tunnel in Gaza. I did some crazy stuff, all in the interest of just trying to kind of wrap my head around what's going on. Um, and, as they say, you go for a week and you can write a book. You go for a month or more and you can write an article. You go for a year or two and you have nothing to say. And so I found my own certitude or certainty about the subject diminishing and maturing over time. I'm sure I'm still, missing a lot, but I'm doing my best, to speak into these issues. And October 7th happened 2 years ago, and that's been pretty much all I've been doing since then. I'm living now with my Peruvian Palestinian wife in the highlands of Peru, in the Andes. And so I'm an independent scholar. And one of the projects I was able to do with my co-editor, Ross Wagner, is to edit a volume, which I can hold up and promote here, Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza, a collection of essays that I contributed to and edited. Way more work than I thought it was going to be, but it was a labor of love to sort of offer to the church a call, an invitation, maybe even a challenge to open their eyes, like my eyes have been opened, and to hear stories. There's 4 Palestinian authors in the book. There's a Jewish Israeli. There's a Latina. There's different denominations, and we're all trying to speak into the issue of what we've learned on the ground and what we've learned about what the church isn't getting right or is missing on the subject.
Well, thank you for that. This sounds like a very personal thing. Like, this isn't just, I wanted to write an article. It just sounds like your life has been sort of taken by this for a while. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, there are days when I wish I could escape, but I think this is my calling. I was going to say this later, but one of the the corollaries or challenges of that kind of work is battles with despair, with rage. Not to kind of get depressing at the beginning of the conversation, but it's challenging to stay encouraged, to be real honest. But we do what we can do. Despair is the luxury of the privileged. Is that what they say?
Yeah, I guess that it's a privilege to be able to despair and give up. Whereas I
Yeah,
guess if you're in a dire situation, you don't have that luxury to take a
yeah,
pause.
exactly, exactly.
Well, with that tone, I wasn't going to ask this question, but like, I don't even know how to have this conversation.
Mm.
Honestly, the tone, my usual interview tones are very playful, upbeats. We've had some more serious topics. We talked about Holocaust theology for one of the things I've done, but even that is, that's 80 years ago. It's in the past, but this is happening now.
Yeah,
I don't know how to approach this. I don't know how to talk about it without, having that sense of just exhaustion and helplessness and as you said, despair. I don't know. I don't know how to have
yeah.
this conversation. How do
And
you have
the despair or the struggle for me is, of course, in a couple of different directions. One is my own sense of impotence. With all the work that I've done with my colleagues, has one child survived who wouldn't have? uh, you know, um, and then despair and struggles with what's going on the ground, the military campaign, the slaughter, and U.S. military support, protection, and complicity. And then finally, struggles over my people, the Christian community, and their attitudes towards what's going on. Which I thought would have changed over 2+ years. I was expecting naively to see people finally say, okay, there's a red line. I'm not going to keep promoting the same story that I have in the past. But it's rare for, at least in my experience, to see that kind of change happening. So yeah, we do the work. Um, we hope and we pray. We try to be faithful. We try to approach it with some kind of epistemic humility, because I know I don't get everything and there's lots that we miss. But here we are. So sorry for putting a cloud on this whole thing
it's
as we get
inherently
started.
it
Yeah.
comes pre-clouded.
Uh,
um well, I mean, you brought up the Christian community there. I think let's start with the Bible, maybe, because this is a big conversation. We can go a lot of
yeah.
different directions, but maybe let's just start with how do we interpret the Bible? What does it have to say about this? Because many Christians believe the Bible requires Christians to support modern day Israel. Can you tell us a bit about that position and the main texts that are usually enlisted to support it?
Yeah, yeah. So you're right, and we hear this regularly from Christians in in positions of influence, whether it's in the church or in politics. And the most commonly cited Bible verse by far is Genesis 12, verse 3, which uh, reads, "I will bless those who bless you." The one God speaking to Abraham, of course. The one who curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And this has been taken. I mean, there are other verses, right? Psalm 122, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Psalm 137, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. There's favorite verses that talk about the our heart's cry, our passion for the land of the Bible, for the land of Jesus. And all of that's it's great. But what sometimes happens is these verses get used or instrumentalized or even weaponized. And that's unfortunately what I see happening. In addition to that, I'll come back to that verse, but in addition to those individual sort of sound bites, there's also, to be fair, a very dominant theme in the prophetic text of our Hebrew Bible or Old Testament about restoration. And, we've got the Israelites in exile, perhaps in Babylon, and they're hearing these voices of assurance, of comfort, like in Isaiah, and promises that, things are going to get better. The bright days lie ahead. And so the question is, for Christians, how do we understand those hopes and promises of restoration? And is there any relationship between that hopeful song and what's going on around us in the world today in the last, let's say, 80 years or 150 years? So that's one of the big questions. When it comes to Genesis 12:3, obviously one might ask the question, what does it mean to bless Abraham? Many misquote the verse, and for example, famously, recently, Ted Cruz, you may have seen his interview on Tucker Carlson's show, and I jotted down what he said. It was this: I was taught from the Bible that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. I want to be on the blessing side of things. And so a couple of things about that. First of all, he's inserted the word Israel. He doesn't remember because he couldn't remember where the verse is from. Okay, well, no judgment there. But he's quoting this verse as sort of his mantra, and he inserts the word Israel, A, and B, he's essentially equating the Israel as in the Jacob and Jacob's kids, the patriarchs and their children, with the modern nation state of Israel. And then thirdly, if I'm counting right, he says, I want to be on the blessing side of things. So it's really actually a self-referential comment about receiving the blessings of God. And this is really important, especially here where I live in the global south. I'm in Peru, and in South America, Latin America, in Africa, Christian Zionism is surging. Christian Zionists here love that verse, and it's kind of used to bolster a kind of prosperity theology, or what I call a transactional theology, in which individuals and even entire nations that have a Christian population are thinking that if they bless the modern state of Israel, then God will bless them, not just individually with, a harvest or with, childbearing, but as a nation. And so blessing Israel is a national project that includes pilgrimage, but it also includes votes in the UN. It includes various kinds of diplomatic interventions, purchasing of weaponry, et cetera, et cetera. So this verse is personal to me in part because of where I live, but they're really getting that language of I want to be on the blessing side of things from American missionaries and others who, maybe the one who gets the most credit for promulgating this idea is John Hagee, mega church pastor there in San Antonio, Texas, who promotes this kind of idea that we must support the modern state of Israel as America, or God will judge us. So all of that is profoundly confused kind of thinking that raises questions about what is Israel and how do we relate ancient Israelites or Judeans, to use the New Testament language, with the modern 19th and 20th century nation state project that emerges out of European nationalism and forges this entity alongside all these other nation states that come along out of the Ottoman Empire and other empires as they disintegrated. So that's that's a starting point. I think maybe the obvious second question related to that would be, how do Christians rightly think about Israel? We've introduced the word Israel into this discussion, even though it's not in Genesis 12. But how do we think about Israel, the kind of Israel that Paul would talk about in, say, Romans 11, in this post-Jesus world? Now that Jesus has come, and now that the early Jewish followers decided that Jesus was their Messiah, that the resurrection was God's declaration of approval on this Jewish Messiah, and that somehow he was the hope of Israel. What do we do with that in light of all these promises of restoration? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. If you've got anything to add, I'm sure you do. But that's one of the questions. Who is Israel after Jesus?
That's
Uh,
a great question. Who is Israel after Jesus? I've struggled to articulate that myself. I feel less an answer and more two types of answers that I want to avoid. And maybe
okay.
you can help me reframe this. Because on the one hand, um, I do think something has happened in Jesus that's different. But on the other hand, I don't want to just say New Testament replaces Old Testament, church
Yeah.
replaces Israel, and there's almost this sort of Marcionite type of thing. I don't want to do that, but at the same time, I do believe that Jesus changes things, and I've
Right.
I've really struggled to know how to not go to those two extremes. But I'd love to hear how you've thought it through. Um,
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I do think we have to reckon with Jesus. We can't expect non-Jesus following Jews to follow this argument and find it persuasive. But here we are as Jesus followers. What do we do? And on the one hand, I want to say it would never have occurred to Paul or Luke in the New Testament that somehow the church replaced Israel. That kind of language would make no sense to them. If anything, they saw the Israel of God as expanding to include non Jewish members, right? It had done that all along, and now it's doing it in a big way. How do you get in? Not just by getting circumcised, like in the old days, but now you get in by being in Christ or by embracing the Jewish Messiah. And so they're seeing it as expansion and inclusion, uh, not a replacement, right? So the language of replacement theology or supersessionism gets thrown around. I find that really unhelpful for that reason. Plus, of course, the fact that Christians through the centuries have indulged in various kinds of supersessionism, punitive supersessionism. God is punishing the Jews, throwing them out because they rejected and crucified uh, the Messiah. And so they should wander aimlessly in the wilderness as punishment for their rejection. Right? That's the supersessionism of many generations, and that's something I repudiate. I think along with you. I also want to say this, and I'd love your reaction to this. I would say that the New Testament writers are all kind of getting out of bed in the morning asking this question, or maybe they're lying awake at night saying, how do we think about Israel, the people of God, the children of Abraham and Jacob, in light of this surprising development and this sense that the blessings of Abraham. Now I'm thinking about Acts 3, Galatians 3. The blessings of Abraham are inherited by those who are in Christ. Uh, my possibly controversial comment, at least in some circles, would be that I don't think the writers of the New Testament necessarily all had the same answer to that. And and I think some of them still imagine some kind of territorial restoration. Acts 1, the disciples are saying, is now the time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel. Um, in Matthew, you have you have Jesus saying things like, um, many will come from east and west and sit at table. They're coming from east and west where? To it's poetry, right? It's metaphor, but it sort of imagines a place. Um, and I I'm not, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, also in Matthew. I'm not sure that we can entirely throw out the idea that some writers had both a trust and faith in Jesus as the hope of Israel and some kind of notion that restoration in some physical way, like maybe they imagined the Gentiles making pilgrimage to Jerusalem, just like we find in the prophets, right? They're all going to come here. Jesus is going to rule. I don't know. On the other hand, you have people like, I don't know, John, for example, John chapter 4. An hour is coming when neither on this mountain, Mount Gerizim up in Nablus in the West Bank, nor in Jerusalem will they worship, as if to say geography, territory is really not that important anymore because I, Jesus, according to John, am the temple. I, Jesus, am Israel. I, Jesus, am the locus of God's presence. So you don't need a building. You've got me. which is audacious, but there it is in the Gospel of John, right? So, so maybe John and Matthew would have a really good, long, robust debate or argument trying to work this question out, because it's not clear to me that they all were necessarily on the same page. They all believe that Jesus is their Messiah, but how? But I think they're looking into the fog, like all prophets did. They're looking into the mists and wondering how this is all going to play out. God's got this, but don't ask me to give you the details about how this is all going to be restored.
I don't think
What do you think?
that I don't think that has to be that controversial, except in a very narrow definition of inspiration. Because I
Right.
mean, it assumes that truth has to just be one statement instead of this sort of dialectical back and forth, a conversation between authors that's meant to not just tell you the truth, but help you see the different sides of it.
Yeah.
And and also, I mean, it's eschatology. It's precisely that which is beyond our current state and world, which they're tasting, but the authors haven't all glimpsed it for themselves because they're not dead yet or they haven't resurrected, right? So it's precisely the one thing they shouldn't necessarily have one voice on. Um, I think an interesting way to go of it, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I like the. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, you go. You
I
go.
was thinking about this universal expansion of Israel instead of replacement of it, and I, I think, I mean, going back to Genesis 12, that the verse, those who, bless you, I'll bless, and curse you, that I'll curse. That chapter also includes, and through you, all nations on earth will be blessed. And
Yes.
so, even Israel, going back to the very first thing, Genesis 12, was always meant to be fulfilled by expanding globally, or at least in some way for the good of the universal. So I think it's not even an expansion of the original mission. It's just the fulfillment of it to
Yeah.
some extent. And
That
I
I
wonder
think
if this
that's
whole conflict comes back to which part of that chapter you emphasize or don't.
and there are only two places in the New Testament where Genesis 12:3 is echoed or quoted. And one is that Galatians 3 passage. But here's the other one. It's at the end of Acts 3, and it's exactly your point. Like, listen to the way this can I read this couple verses here? You are the descendants of the prophets and of the covenant God gave to your ancestors, saying to Abraham, and in your descendants, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Okay, there's the quote. Now, what does he do with it? Verse 26. When God raised up his servant, he sent him first to you to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways. So here he is. He's not talking about real estate. He's talking about repentance. And he's sending him first to you, and then you're going to go out with the message. And it's turning you from, so here's the blessing. Repent, turn, recognize, embrace, and then carry that message to the world. I think that's exactly how at least Luke in Acts 3 is reading the Genesis 12 text in light of Jesus.
Well, I think that's so interesting because even if we are supposed to support modern day Israel in the same way as the Old Testament, and even if they are the same things, how do Old Testament prophets deal with the nation? They're constantly calling it to repent. So even if
Right.
it is everything the Zionist position says it is, we still might be called to critique, to call for repent, even if you assume a Zionist framework, right?
And that's right. And Gary Burge does a nice job with this in his book, Whose Land, Whose Promise. And he sort of grants that, hypothesis that you just granted. And okay, what if Israel today, in claiming the land in the Middle East, in some way has a right to that land based upon divine promise, through the Old Testament? Well, what does the promise come with? Well, it comes with conditions. It comes with attachments. First of all, it's very clear that the land doesn't belong to Israel, belongs to God, with sort of residency permits issued to the Israelites, and their presence in the land is entirely contingent. It's entirely conditional on their faithfulness, on their justice. Jeremiah 7, he's warning them that they're going to go to Babylon and be exiled out of the land. And one of the main things that he lists is their mistreatment of the marginal, the abuse of those amongst them that are needing protection. And he says, you guys are you're going to get kicked out, So that's the kind of corollary, as you say, if Christian Zionists want to contend that the modern political nation state has some kind of theological significance, then you got to kind of get the whole package. You can't just pick and choose, the blessings and not the imperatives or the uh, and the things that are required of those who receive that blessing.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Um, so it sounds like you there's this kind of multi even if and even if and even if. So like even if Israel still is something in the literal sense of it, that doesn't necessarily mean the current Israeli government, because Israel is not specifically a government. And you said that doesn't necessarily mean the modern European notion of nation in terms of Israel. And even if it were to be the nation, it doesn't mean the nation is always going to be right without need of critique or prophetic rebuke. And so there's this sort of like, even if you take there's even if, you know what I mean, like the whole thing is bracketed by all of these things that should prevent what's currently happening from being justifiable. Is there any part in that chain that I'm missing that we need to
Yeah.
highlight?
I mean, one thing to highlight is that the Christian Zionists, and for your viewers, maybe to define that phrase, Zionist Christians who believe that Jews have a right not only to be in the land, but to be dominant over the land, to have hegemony um, politically, culturally, demographically. So the argument that Jews have, by virtue of their Jewishness, by virtue of their, descendancy from Jacob, they have a status in the land that no one else has, and we need to defend and protect that. So Christian Zionists would always want to qualify this language of blessing Israel by saying, we're not saying Israel is perfect. It's not that they never do anything wrong. And I've had this conversation with dozens and dozens of Christian Zionists. I've written about this question and challenged many of them in person and in writing. And I want to say, okay, Israel isn't perfect. Tell me the imperfections. Like what exactly do you see in Israel that you call imperfect? And invariably it's abstract. Invariably it's, the kind of rogue soldier, the bad apple, the occasional misstep that some individual within the hierarchy of the IDF, commits. Or maybe they don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, so it's all about him, But invariably, it's not substantive; it's abstract, and it uses the passive voice, and mistakes have been made, and so while they say on the one hand, blessing Israel does not preclude criticizing Israel, as soon as you get specific and you say, hey, this policy, not just practice, this policy of Israel is disproportionate punishment and collective punishment. As soon as you start getting specific, then they back off, or they switch and they're back to defending Israel again. So I kind of call, am I allowed to say bullshit on your program here? I kind of call them on that sort of insincere pretending or faux willingness to criticize when it never translates into anything substantive. They're never going to be prophetic like a John the Baptist who warned you to flee from the wrath to come. They're never going to be a Jeremiah because they're too busy worrying about perceptions of anti-Semitism, perceptions of, some kind of Islamist threat, perceptions of the war on terror, to really get down serious to critiquing. I mean, if your friend is drunk, you take away the keys, right? You don't let him drive. I mean, that's what you do to good friends. You you challenge them in their behavior, and I just don't see that in Christian Zionist language or behavior toward Israel, and it certainly hasn't changed very much at all since October 7th.
Well, it's interesting because I mean, a lot of people are trying to nuance things or justify it in some way, like, oh, what you think's happening is just the media. Some people are, they're trying to explain it with the text, but there are occasionally some people who just sort of say, yeah, I admit what is happening is horrific, but then they just justify the horrors by appealing to biblical texts, like blotting out the Amalekites from the land. They
Mm-hmm.
sort of just admit and swallow the pill. How, and they're using the Bible to do it. How might you respond to that kind of biblical reasoning? And I don't like it, but given the history of how the land was gotten in the first place, it's
Yeah.
hard to not see the logic.
Yeah, no, I'm again with you on that. In fact, I just gave a talk in September in Chicago, and I think the main title was "When Sacred Texts Terrify," and the subtitle, if I remember correctly, was something about reading Joshua in a time of genocide, uh, something like that. You can find it on the the Church at the Crossroads website if people want to look for it. Are you? So we could talk about that conference later, but I'll just get back to the topic at hand here. Yeah, the Amalek story is probably the most blatant example of weaponizing the Bible that I could think of. Uh, it turns a conflict today, modern conflict over territory, demography, ideology, into a cosmic battle, right? It renders Palestinians the perpetual enemy. And so compromise and negotiations are ruled out. And then Israel, by contrast, is sanctified. Their motivations are pure, and any resistance to that must be anti-Semitic or worse. Maybe you're aligning with, the forces of evil. It was Benjamin Netanyahu who brought this Amalek language back into the discourse just like 3 weeks after October 7th, when he was announcing a ground offensive in Gaza, and he said publicly, "Remember what Amalek did to you. We remember and we fight." And of course, he's quoting from 1 Samuel, where God commands Israel to utterly destroy all that they have, talking about the Amalekites, kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So Netanyahu was not just simply calling for an elimination of combatants. He was, declaring infants guilty. I had an interesting conversation with a IDF soldier this summer. I was in Central Europe, up in Latvia, and I won't give you the backstory, but he started telling me his experience. He just had left Gaza, and it turns out, I mean, we were talking at a Holocaust museum where Nazis had demonized, dehumanized all levels of Jewish society. And he looked at me and without embarrassment assured me that all the children are guilty and they all deserve, to be punished. They all want to kill them. And so he was, a little foot soldier saying the same thing that, Netanyahu said a couple of years earlier, and that is, we get to kill all the children. He didn't quote Amalek, but that's where some of this comes from. It's not a big surprise that South Africa quoted Netanyahu at the ICJ when they were bringing out evidence of Israel's genocidal intent, because that's exactly what it sounds like. Okay, so you've got Netanyahu doing it. He wasn't the first Israeli to do it, but he was the most deadly. But we have Christians doing the same thing. And I'm going to name some names. Mike Cosper, for example, who worked for Christianity Today and produced the Promised Land podcast series. He equated Hamas with Amalek. He made a link between the two. There's a couple of professors at Baylor, one evangelical, one Jewish, who both made that connection. Uh, Peter Leithart of the Gospel Coalition. Uh, the most egregious I've discovered comes from the International, um, what is it, ICEJ, International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, which is based in Jerusalem, the ICEJ, and several of their spokespeople basically wanted to talk about Amalek as demonic. And so Hamas is possessed by a demon, by demons. That was how they were, appropriating Amalek, and essentially, without admitting it, justifying the very same kind of action, this sort of complete destruction that Netanyahu has called for, and that Israel has been, prosecuting over these last 2 years. The rabbis tend to be a lot wiser. They've struggled with this one over the centuries, and Maimonides thought, if Amalek had repented, they could have been forgiven. There's lots of attempts along there. We talked earlier about the Bible as a conversation, the Bible as an ongoing, back and forth, and that's how they read Scripture. And they're much more reluctant through the centuries to turn this ancient story into some kind of a mandate for slaughter in the modern era. It's to me, it's repugnant. It's deeply troubling, and it not just weaponizes, but it sort of spiritualizes the carnage in a way that it's one of those things that makes me want to, scream at the church for being a part of that. I'll stop there.
Well, I don't want to force you to talk more about if it's really upsetting stuff, but I can't even imagine what it must have felt like to be physically with someone saying the children are guilty. What's even going, what's even going on in your head or mind? And you don't have to share if you don't want to, but just
No.
being
In that instance, I got quite animated, and I started pointing outside to the displays that we had just see. Look where you're standing, and look at the story. You are saying about Palestinians what Nazis said about your people, and I was like, I probably wasn't shouting, but I was quite animated. My wife was standing outside, sort of trying to stay safe. It didn't go anywhere. He just sort of, I don't know, nodded or went away. Nobody was going to convince anybody, but I made it very clear to him that what he was doing, and where he was doing it was absolutely out of bounds and horrific. Yeah.
You brought up the Holocaust there. What it's such a, it's just such a massive topic that is inevitably part of this conversation,
Yeah.
for better or for worse. In what ways is it helpful to have that in the background, and in what ways is it not helpful to have that in the background, and to see these as fundamentally qualitatively different things, or
Yeah.
as somehow, I don't even know how to start that conversation.
Yeah. And I think we as Christians, part of the Christian tribe that were heavily involved and complicit in the Holocaust, need to be very, very careful about any kind of, usage. We don't want to weaponize the Holocaust. There have been, however, a number of Jewish scholars who are sort of pointing the way and drawing some of the parallels. And to draw parallels doesn't equate the two, but it certainly says maybe we should, be learning. The obvious refrain that comes out of the Holocaust is never again. And the response to that is, well, never again for anyone, right? Nobody should be subject to that kind of horrific treatment. There have been, maybe you've run into some of these people like Omer Bartov, whose families are Holocaust survivors, Raz Siegel, Norman Finkelstein, also descendant of Holocaust survivors, Sarah Roy. There are a number of Jewish scholars who are drawing parallels and who are, the question. One of the questions is in this field is to what extent is the Holocaust unique, uh, sui generis, as opposed to sort of your run-of-the-mill genocide, which horrors have been happening since empires were invented, right? Peoples have been snuffed out in one way or another. And certainly the U.S., the Americans have done their part in, genociding a people or multiple peoples. So the question is, does the Holocaust stand apart from that whole conversation, or is it one of several examples? And, guys like Omar Bartov are making the argument that it is, one of several. And the reason why the Holocaust is separated, partly it's because, we did it, but partly it's because it happened to predominantly light-skinned people as opposed to Africans, Latin Americans, North American Indians. So there's some factors in there that complicate things. As in addition to the fact that, Jews, so that Christian anti-Judaism morphed into anti-Semitism, which then laid the groundwork for this horror we call the Holocaust. So there's blood on our hands collectively. And so I want to be very careful. But I also want to pay attention to some of these scholars who are doing that kind of work from within their community. And of course, they're getting targeted. And, in one case, a scholar lost an appointment. And there's other consequences they are facing for doing that kind of work. Finkelstein is one of the most explicit. He talks about the Holocaust industry. It's very cynical in terms of the way he sees the Holocaust functioning, not just to declare sort of Jews unique, but also to sort of give them a pass for anything they do thereafter. We Jews were run out of Europe. We needed a safe place. Here we are in the land, and now you're going to dare criticize us for making ourselves safe in this part of the world. That's he would say, kind of a weaponization of the Holocaust to sort of clear the Israeli state from any possible moral culpability for what they're doing in the present. And I don't think he's entirely wrong.
Well, that's kind of a helpful framing to pivot away from the biblical question to more the historical background, because we haven't even really gotten to the question of what's happening in Gaza and Israel right now. We're setting the table, I think. So we've talked about the biblical stuff a little bit, and now that we're kind of bringing in the Holocaust, for those of our listeners unfamiliar with the history, could you take us back to 1948, the 1940s, or as early as you need to go to give us a sense of how all of this really got started?
Yeah. I mean, 1940 is a good place. I'm going to go back a little earlier, though. And partly because you'll often hear Christian Zionists, and I've heard this from Jews as well, that the conflict between Arabs and Jews is not eternal, but age old. Goes back to Isaac and Ishmael. It goes back to Jacob and Esau. It's not something that's going to go away. So you just kind of shrug your shoulders and deal with it the best you can. When, I think that the evidence points elsewhere to suggest that the conflict really is a modern one, maximum 150 years old. Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims were, for the most part, coexisting. There were hierarchies, but there was a lot of coexistence, whether you're talking about Spain or the Middle East, North Africa. Then comes the Zionist movement, which starts to see waves of migrants coming from Europe. Theodor Herzl gets, the credit for being the kind of grandfather of Zionism. And he's worried about a couple of things, legitimately worried. One is anti-Semitism, which he sees in Western Europe, for example. He's also in Eastern Europe, but he's also seeing assimilation in Western Europe. So Jews are either being persecuted or they're sort of disappearing into the generic culture of Europe. And either way, he's concerned. And it was particularly the anti-Semitism that drove him to push for a haven somewhere. And here he is under the Ottoman period, at least in the Middle East, looking for a place that some empire will grant him. And he would have been happy with somewhere in Africa or South America. He was a secular Jew, but eventually the religious Jews, make it clear that they're only going to sign on if the project relates to their historic ties to their homeland in Israel-Palestine. So the waves start to come. Arab Palestinians respond in different ways, right? I mean, some of them are welcoming hospitality, helping these poor Jews coming from wherever. Some of them are starting to fear and suspect and maybe resent what's happening around them. And then, of course, by the 20s and the 30s, you have significant resistance, opposition, and violence. Most notably at the end of the 30s, 1936 to 39. So by the time World War II is unfolding, you've got significant populations of Palestinians who see the Zionist arrival as a threat to their, place in the land, to their control, to their livelihood, et cetera, et cetera. So that's when meanwhile, Britain's wanting out. After World War II, they're exhausted. They want to give up the mandate they've had for 30 years. They want to give that up for, a UN project. And the newly formed UN, decides to propose. They didn't mandate, they proposed a partition. The UN, did not have, the General Assembly did not have a legal arm. They were suggesting something and looking for the assent of the Jews and the Arabs in the region, and that the terms of that struck the Arabs as unfair. And looking back today, would their ancestors wish that they had accepted the terms and gone with the UN proposal? Probably, but you really can't blame them at the time for seeing a certain unfairness, a certain skewing of the situation. You can agree or disagree with me on that, but that's how they saw it. They felt it was unfair, and so they resist. And so, conflict begins. Here's a really important point, though. Before before Israel declared itself a nation state in the spring of 1948, Zionist militias had already forced out 250,000 Palestinians from their homes and villages. It didn't simply happen after they declared themselves a state. When surrounding Arabs started to come in, and Jordan especially, they began resisting with guns. Already in 1947 and the first quarter of 1948, you've got 250,000 refugees being forced out or fleeing in fear from their homeland in Israel-Palestine. And then another 500,000 get forced out and before the armistice in 1949 happens. All told, then, here's the story from 1948. From the Palestinian perspective, you have 750,000, give or take, people who not only A, lost their homes, their villages, their land, but B, were not allowed to return. When a war ends, you're supposed to allow the non-combatants to come back, and that never happened. In fact, there were laws passed right away. Villages were destroyed, houses were demolished, all of which was intended to prevent Palestinians from, coming back and restarting their lives. And why was that? Because the Zionist project, led by Ben-Gurion, saw a need to prevail not just territorially, but also demographically. They wanted land and they wanted a majority population. They wanted 70, 80%, Jews in the land in order, in their minds, to preserve Jewish culture, Jewish rights, Jewish culture, flourishing and so on. So that was what came out of the 48-49 war, which Palestinians call their catastrophe, Israelis call their war of independence. And that's really the kind of, um, you know, demon or ghost or issue that lingers. People might say, well, okay, wars happen, people get displaced, move on. Uh, but Palestinians, have a connection to their land like nothing I'll ever be able to imagine. I've lived in a dozen places, and I'm kind of detached, to be really honest, from my land of my birth. We don't understand the connection that Palestinians who have been there for centuries feel to their place and to their olive trees, to their groves, and so on. And so Palestinians have stood fast. They've shown sumud, as they call it, steadfastness or perseverance, in asking the world to recognize their rights. And so then the question is, okay, well, how are they going to coexist, right? I don't know if you want to jump in, but the next question is, what are we going to do now that Israel is in control, but there are Palestinians in the region? Of course, 1967 is the other big milestone when Israel not only controlled what today is called Israel proper, but took territory that had been claimed by Jordan in 1949, took territory that had been claimed by Egypt, by Syria. All of this territory then expands Israel. However, Israel doesn't move its borders. In fact, Israel has never declared its borders for a very important reason, because if they draw the border, let's say along the Jordan River, then all of a sudden all the West Bank Palestinians are part of the state of Israel. And then what do you do with them? Do you give them the vote? What kind of treatment do you have? So they've kept them in legal limbo, what the world calls occupation, a military arrangement that allows them to kind of keep them at an arm's length from full civil rights. They're under a military government. So military law applies to Palestinians in the West Bank in a way that it doesn't apply to either Jews in the West Bank or Jews in the modern state of Israel. So that's created, this kind of really uneven playing field, and adds to the frustrations, the anger of Palestinians, and then of course leads to uprising. One happens in the late 80s, another one happens in the early 2000s that get very violent. But as Palestinians have learned, when you get violent with the state of Israel, what you get in return is disproportionality. That's explicit in their documents, and we see it on the ground, and we've seen it for the last 2 years, of course, in Gaza. You end up losing land. You end up seeing more settlers move into land that you want to use. You end up seeing Palestinians die or get imprisoned, and yeah, the punishment for misbehavior for Palestinian uprisings has been absolutely deadly. Um, that's sort of the big picture, but we should probably zoom in a little bit on Gaza. But let me pause there.
Yeah. Well, I think the history is so important because it frames so much how you interpret every event that happens now. Um, how does this history impact how we see, for example, Hamas and terrorism and these types of things? Like, how does your interpretation of the history impact how we think about what's going on in 2025 right now?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so you have, I guess you could say, two options. I'm sure you have 22, but one option is to say the Palestinians are stubborn rejectionists. They've been offered this or that. They've had opportunities to put down their weapons. What they're insistent on is some kind of final solution in which Jews just leave, they're expelled, and Palestinian dominance, and perhaps even Muslim dominance over the land is reinstated. And in that case, you may see Israel locked in an existential battle, right, for their survival, and only one side can win, and collateral damage, as in civilian casualties, children dying, that's all basically unavoidable. So that's your one option is so Palestinians as rejectionists. The other option is, of course, Palestinians as reactionists. They're reacting to various events that have overtaken them, um, and they've come to recognize that what they really want is some kind of self-determination, whether that be a state of their own or some kind of autonomy, or maybe even just simply equal rights in their homeland. For many years, I've thought that at least the 40 and under crowd in Palestine, the younger generation, have basically given up on a state of their own. They don't really care. They didn't really care as much about that. They kind of wanted to say, here, Israel, you win. Here are the keys. You get everything. But now give us the vote, right? Now give us equal rights. You incorporate us into your state. You win, but we're just asking to be treated equally. To which many on the Israeli side would say, absolutely not. That's the problem we're trying to avoid, is a state in which all of its, residents, all the people under Israeli control have equal status under the law. We saw this most recently in 2018 with the Jewish nation state law that was passed that declares that only Jews have national rights in the land. Palestinians may have individual rights, but they don't have any collective rights. That's a right that explicitly belongs only to Jews. So you've got a hierarchy. Anyway, so that's the dilemma, is how do Palestinians respond to their present situation? They've tried a lot of things. They've tried, fomenting a movement we call BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions, trying to get the international community to say, hey, how about if you put some pressure on Israel to change their practice, to change their behavior? So maybe you could boycott products that are made in the West Bank, or maybe you could divest from funds that are investing in the West Bank, or maybe you could even sanction, as a state, you could sanction Israel for its what the international community calls illegal movement of settlers into the West Bank. So BDS was a nonviolent movement, right? It was to be operated in the public square, in the courts. That has been declared in many places, including some in the U.S., to be anti-Semitic. So you don't get to do that. Okay, well, what else do you do? Well, they tried various. The first Intifada was largely nonviolent. Brackets. There was rock throwing, to be sure, and I don't want anybody to throw a rock at me. But if I'm fully garbed in military gear and I'm inside a tank, rocks aren't really going to threaten me. But it was largely nonviolent, and it was largely sort of homegrown and grassroots, and that was responded to very violently. Of course, the second Intifada was even more deadly for Palestinians. Uh, you've got, you had elections in 2006, a fair election. People like Jimmy Carter said, "Oh, this is a clean election," but the problem was the wrong team won. Hamas won the election, and so we're moving in the direction of democracy. But as soon as that happened, then the world clamps down and cuts off funds and does all kinds of punishing because the wrong party got chosen. So Hamas rises up and watches the sort of Palestinian issue sliding off of the table, off the radar of the world community. It sees the Abraham Accords as normalizing relations between Israel and nations like Bahrain and the UAE and Sudan and Morocco and others. So they look at that and say, okay, how are we going to get the world's attention? How are we going to get ourselves back in the spotlight? And they decided to break out of their prison that they'd been held in, along with 2.2 million Gazans since the mid 2007, and did some horrible things. Right? They committed atrocities. They committed war crimes. If you want to say their acts were genocidal, I won't argue with you. But what has resulted from that, of course, is behavior that is, I want to say infinitely, but certainly exponentially far more deadly uh, on the Gazans, not just on combatants, but also on non-combatants. The entire Gaza Strip has been made uninhabitable, and Israel has gone after not just fighters and dugouts, but hospitals, universities, schools, clinics, hospitals, all of the you could say all of the places that hold together a society, all the places that allow a society to preserve its memories, its culture, its life, and to continue. And that is what makes a number of scholars want to call what Israel's doing genocidal, because they're really taking away all of the pillars, not just life and not just injury, but they're also taking away all of the implements and instruments of survival as a people. Maybe individuals will survive. We have individual North American Indians surviving, but cultures have been destroyed. Peoples collectively have been destroyed, and that's exactly what genocide scholars are seeing going on in Gaza. Maybe I got off topic there, but that's kind of the latest.
I think you've given the history. I think you've helped bring it up to today. I think there was a sense that peace almost seemed like a possibility in maybe the '90s and that kind of period, but then, um, in the last few decades, Netanyahu kind of comes to the fore, and then there's October 7th, 2023. Can you
Yeah,
maybe this is where we finally do get to Gaza right now? Can you
yeah,
tell
yeah.
us what changes October 7th and what has happened in Gaza since? For people who haven't been watching, the videos, who don't even like, what is it on the ground the last few years that's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned the 90s as a possible period of hope. So maybe I could just start with that and then jump ahead. Um, yeah, there were many people in the mid 90s that looked to what came to be called the Oslo Accords as kind of a pathway. Um, Certain observers, among them Edward Said, a brilliant Columbia University professor and Palestinian scholar, certain observers saw the Oslo Accords as a bad idea. They saw the writing on the wall. They saw it as a future disaster. Uh, I think Edward Said and others were right. Um, it started in 93, 94, and was supposed to run for 5 years. And one of the big outcomes of that was the creation of something called the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be a interim government for 5 years, so ending in the late 90s. And that was supposed to be the instrument that would build the tools and institutions of state to move forward, in peaceful coexistence. The Oslo Accords never promised Palestinians a state, however, um, and they postponed some of the most central issues, like the status of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, settlements have continued to go up. And one of the important functions of these settlement communities that have been built, which are settlements built in either East Jerusalem or in the West Bank, is that they've created a bit of a ring around East and West Jerusalem so that it's essentially cut off from the rest of the West Bank. So in the Palestinians' mind, they're thinking, of course, East Jerusalem with the Haram, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, of course it's going to be part of a future state, when increasingly it's been severed by Jewish settlements. So that today, no, it's, whatever is left of the West Bank that Palestinians are still allowed to inhabit is really a collection of kind of islands. You could add the island of Gaza, and these islands are only connected if Israel allows them to be through checkpoints and so on. And to be really honest, back in those days in the early 2000s, at first I thought the two-state solution was actually a prospect, but I pretty much lost that as something viable, feasible. When you're asking about a two-state, you need it to be viable, right? It can't just be a dysfunctional sort of state that is economically dead on arrival. It has to be something that can have its own uh, borders and control of its airspace and control of its economy and its exports and imports. And that's just not happening. So Palestinians have seen that. They recognize that Netanyahu, for example, has spent his career insisting that there will never be a Palestinian state. And on his side of things, he thinks one of the things he thinks, or one of the things he says, is that a Palestinian state on our doorstep would just be an invitation for rockets, for terrorism, for Iran to come in, for Hezbollah to move in, and for, we're going to be much more dangerous than we already are. So we've got to keep some kind of military control of this space rather than let them invite their neighbors and create hell for us. So that's the argument, at least one of the arguments that's created. Palestinians, meanwhile, are stuck under military control, and that's where they've been for 17 years in Gaza. Israel pulled its settlements out of Gaza. We're switching to Gaza now. They pulled their settlements out of Gaza in 2005, but then by 2007 they imposed a blockade around Gaza. So even though they said they weren't occupying it, they're controlling what comes in, what goes out, who comes in, who goes out, airspace, sea access. They're basically keeping Gazans on a minimalist diet in order to keep them under control. And they thought, or at least some of them would say, that the Palestinians would get tired of this and would rise up against Hamas. That they would somehow throw off these overlords that are horrible. And this is language that people use all over the place. Pretty sure that Trump is using that right now about Venezuela, and does it ever work? Does the weak population on the street ever really rise up and overthrow an overlord that has all the weapons? So anyway, Gazans have been stuck with a regime that most of them don't like, but then they also see that Israel is doing maybe even worse things, certainly the last 2 years. And Hamas, unlike the PA, actually seems to get some attention. Hamas was elected in Gaza for, I would say, 3 reasons. And I'm getting these from Palestinian voices in Ramallah who were analyzing the election shortly after it happened. One thing was that the PA was seen as corrupt and as essentially a proxy for Israel, doing Israel's dirty work. So the PA, the Palestinian Authority, led by Fatah, which is Abu Mazen's party, Mahmoud Abbas, the PA had no street credibility. Hamas, on the other hand, was seen to be marked by a lack of corruption. They seemed to be, running things. They were running daycare centers and clinics and health clinics and building credibility on the ground. And the PA was getting nothing. They were accomplishing nothing. They were corrupt and ineffective. So for all those reasons, people said, well, hey, let's give Hamas a try. They weren't voting for terrorism. Some of them maybe were, but they weren't voting for terrorism. They weren't voting for another war. They weren't necessarily even Islamists in their ideology and their theology. They were voting against Fatah. They, give the victory to Hamas, and, the world has reacted to them ever since. Hamas has expressed over the years willingness to compromise. And today, many people will hear me talk like this and they'll say, you're pro-Hamas. No, I'm not pro-Hamas. I have profound problems with the tactics, the military tactics, the militancy of Hamas. Anytime you target civilians, I am not okay with that. Whether you're an individual or you're a paramilitary or a state, including the state of Israel. So Hamas is deeply problematic, but they've become more pragmatic over the years since their origins in the late 1980s. And they have expressed through intermediaries and directly a willingness not to celebrate Israel, not to recognize Israel, but to live alongside Israel in some kind of extended coexistence, some kind of truce, you could say. So let the national consensus, they talk about the Palestinian national consensus, determine what comes next. So they've expressed some of this fairly clearly, but here's my view, disagree. Israel doesn't want a a negotiated peace with Hamas. What it wants is to keep Palestinians separated. So they've got these two entities, the PA and Hamas, and as long as they're kind of dividing the people, then Israel could say, well, we don't have a partner to negotiate with, and we're not going to talk to terrorists. We're going to continue to support Fatah, which has no support on the ground. So Israel's kind of happy with the status quo. Then, of course, 2023, October 7th happens, and Israel suffers trauma. It suffers shame. It suffers, deep, deep pain. And of course, that evolves into rage and a desire for vengeance, understandable on all those fronts. But what then happens is that it looks to me like Israel, while claiming to be going after the militants, the Hamas and their tunnels, is really, in my view, looking at this as an opportunity for expulsion. And so they're behaving in a genocidal way, as we've talked about, as a means to an end. They don't think they're going to kill all Palestinians, but if they can make Gaza unlivable, and they've pretty much done that, then what are Palestinians going to do? Either die or leave, right? Those are their choices. And that looks to me like what Israel's maneuvering for. Just yesterday or a couple days ago, it was announced that the Rafah crossing, which is the only crossing that's not into Israel, it goes into Egypt, that crossing was going to open, but only for exits. So Gazans could leave, but never come back. And Egypt is saying, no, 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 it's only going to be two-way or not at all. Well, we'll see where that one goes. But Israel is, has flown out some Gazans and taken them to places like South Africa. It is allowing them now to leave through Gaza, through Egypt. It looks to me like the main plan A for Gaza is human displacement, and whatever means that takes, whatever they can get away with Trump's peace plan, which is not a ceasefire. Like almost 400 people have died since the October ceasefire was put into effect, and something like 900 people have been injured. The bombs haven't stopped falling. The guns haven't stopped firing, and Gazans are, they're a little bit more safe now than they were, but they're still dying, and they're now confined to basically half of the tiny Gaza Strip that they, inhabited before. So you've got some 2 million people confined to a space that is half the size of what they had. And the part that's going to be rebuilt, according to some, is the part that they're not allowed to enter. So it's very hard for me to be hopeful. Like I don't see what the Trump peace plan is going to do for them. I don't. Yeah. This is back to where we started. I'm in a pretty dark place when I look at the situation in Gaza today. I've interviewed some. Just one last thought. One of the ways you get information out of Gaza is social media, through testimony. Doctors, for example, Doctors Without Borders have been volunteering heroically in Gaza. They come out and they tell their stories. People are using social media to show what's going on. And, if Israel claims otherwise, if they want to say it's not as bad as you say, there is no starvation, there is no genocide, then the first step that they need to take is to simply open it up to journalists, to international media. That's not to say Palestinian journalists aren't doing an amazing job, but open it up to the world and let them go in and confirm or challenge your narrative that you're not being disproportionately targeting of civilians and destroying the entire infrastructure of Gaza.
Well, that's interesting because I mean, every time I try to talk to a lot of people about this, and I imagine some of our listeners are probably going to be having this response, that the response that is often, well, is the situation in Gaza really as dire as reported? The media exaggerates. You can't trust information. When you get that kind of response from people, I mean, you've started to address it right now,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
what's your kind of, what do you say to that?
yeah. I mean, first I would say that in war, if we call this a war, both sides have every reason to tell lies, right? So I don't trust Hamas to tell the truth all the time, and I don't trust Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, to tell the truth. I assume that a good amount of what we're getting is war propaganda. So that's number one. So then the question is, well, how do we get reliable information? Now, prior to October 7th, the Ministry of Health in Gaza has been, giving figures, mortality figures, etc., that Israel has by and large found to be accurate. So they were trusting Gaza's Ministry of Health before all this started to happen. Now, how does Hamas and the Ministry of Health actually count the dead, right? In this situation, I'm sure their numbers are off. What's striking, though, is that some of the groups that are looking into this. I'm thinking of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy or the Lancet Journal. They're concluding that the body count is probably much higher, not lower, than what Hamas has been saying. Now, am I qualified to mitigate that? No, I have no understanding of that. Uh, what we see, though, is a population that is basically half children, and some 20,000 of the dead are children. We see an awful lot uh, of carnage that women and children that are by no means uh, legitimate targets under wartime, under international law. Uh, in the book that I mentioned that I've co-edited, Gary Burge does a good job in his chapter on the tactics, the bombing tactics that Israel has been using, and the size of the bombs, and the kind of sort of ratio of carnage that Israel has allowed through its artificial intelligence algorithms and the size of its bombing, that ensure that far more die than are simply the targets that are in the crosshairs of an Israeli strike. So are the is the data are the data accurate? Is it as bad as people say? Is it exaggerated? I'm sure there's some of that. Um, but when you listen to doctors, for example, who say, listen, I've done war medicine all around the world. I've been in this war and that war, and I've been in all kinds of hellholes. This is the worst I've ever seen. Where I've seen children targeted in their heads, in their torsos by snipers. Um, I I can't ignore that. I'm not prepared to dismiss the testimony of people that are medical professionals describing what they're seeing in terms of the kinds of carnage that they're experiencing, they're witnessing, the trauma that they're experiencing as doctors. Uh, the big question that maybe your viewers are going to push back with is the question of the ratio of combatants to non-combatants, right? Is it a legitimate, even commendable ratio, or is it a problematic one, right? And here again, I'm not qualified to speak. The usual go-to source that Israelis and Christian Zionists will point to, and other partisans of Israel, would be the articles that have been written by John Spencer, who I want to say he teaches for the War College, American analyst of war. Uh, and so I've read his articles. He's got half a dozen or 10 of them out there, all basically declaring that Israel is behaving appropriately according to the rules of war. Uh, One of the big problems with his articles is that he's using IDF figures, right? I mean, when you're using the data, the statistics from one of the two, sides, um, one wonders again how reliable that can be. Um, but I've read 3 or 4 articles that challenge Spencer's numbers. So all of these, I think, are very much um, contested, and I don't pretend with you to be able to settle any of those disputes. I can tell you what I see and what I hear, the testimonies of people that we know in Gaza who are surviving or who have family members that have died. And to me, it's pretty clear that what Israel is engaged in is is an effort to displace, to do what has come to be called ethnic cleansing, which is once again a war crime. So that's where I come down.
Well, I think we've been talking a lot about the history of the Middle East and Israel and Gaza. I'm in the US right now, and the question that's kind of haunting me is particularly what is the role of America and the
Mm,
American church in all of this and in the decades leading up to it. A lot of my listeners might not even realize that's part of the question, but it's very much so, I believe. Are we complicit in all of
mm,
this?
yeah. Yeah, and of course, my response to that question of complicity is absolutely. I mean, all we need to do is think about where most of the hardware, the bombs and the planes come from to enable Israel to do what it's doing in Gaza. And the answer is the US. It's by far the biggest supplier. So if American citizens were able to put pressure on the US government to stop arming Israel, Israel would have to think of another way to deal with their problems. Um, and a big part of that American population that has influence these days is the Christian community. The 80 million or something self-described evangelicals in the West Bank, sorry, in the U.S., um, who are um, many of whom remain committed um, to the cause and the description of what Israel's up to. They remain supportive of U.S. involvement. So, this is why, for example, this conference I mentioned earlier was convened in Chicago last September, where we gathered for 3 days to listen to experts, to listen to scholars, and to talk about what's going on there and to respond to the cries of Palestinians who are, looking to us as really well positioned to help stop what's going on, to stop the bloodletting. And so we met. Out of that came the Chicago Declaration, which I would love to encourage your viewers to look up. It's found that I want to say Chicago Declaration. No, no, no. Church at the Crossroads/Declaration would be where you would find it. And it's something to read, to ponder, to hear, as it is itself a response to Palestinians. And then you have the opportunity to sign it, to add your name to this declaration as a way of, declaring, yeah, we are complicit, but we want it to stop. We want to do something different. We want to follow the Lord Jesus, who calls us to bless and not curse, to love our enemies, not just our friends. So I mean that complicity. I mean the complicity cuts across all swaths of society, and I could name names. I've mentioned a few. I've been deeply disappointed in Christianity Today, for example, um, and I've written about it in the there's a whole chapter on Christianity Today written by Ben Norquist in our book. Um, uh, there's other groups like the easy target would be the Christians United for Israel, which is a massive political action organization founded by John Hagee. Um, Other groups, the Philos Project, the 700 Club. There's plenty of scholars and public figures that I could name as well that are um, continuing, even these 2 years later, to sort of sound the same message. It's like nothing has changed for you. Like you continue to see this as okay. Um, and, and that's what gets me so discouraged. And again, back to where we started, my despair is is at myself, it's at the situation on the ground and all of the horrors that are unfolding, but it's also at the the failure of so many to recognize their complicity and their participation, direct or indirect, in what's going on.
Well, and I think I'm terrified to ask this question because I think you've already given the answer repeatedly. I just don't like the answer. I don't think you like it either. But I mean, if we are complicit, what do we actually do about it? Especially, I mean, I told someone I was doing this interview, and they were like, "Well, that Gaza's done. Trump fixed it, right?" And I'm like, "I don't think so. I think it, and it's like so. I mean, if this is just a pause, and it's not even a pause, really. Like, what do people who are in America, who are in the West, what can we actually do? Like, what are tangible action steps? And I think my sense is I have no idea. I keep
Yeah,
trying grand stuff, and I think you're probably feeling a sense of I have no idea either. Nothing seems to do anything. But is there anything that we can do?
yeah. So we should probably frame our response to that by saying we do the right thing not because it's effective, but because it's the right thing. I mean, we have to respond to the moral calling on our lives not because it's pragmatic. We hope it is effective, but that's not ultimately what motivates us. Um, so, with that having been said, I think the first thing I would say, in addition to the sort of the predictable, call for um, prayer and meditation and reflection, is to get informed. Right, a lot of people are stuck in a media bubble, and my critics might say, I'm stuck in a media bubble, but they don't know what I read. They don't know all the sources I use. And I would just say, if you want to get out of the Western media bubble, there's all kinds of places to go. I mean, I would again promote our book that's come out recently, Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza, but it's by no means the only source. Munter Isaac, who's a now world renowned pastor and scholar who has been for years been based in Bethlehem, um, preached a sermon that went viral and now has a book out called Christ in the Rubble. Um, so that would be another place to start. There are great resources out there. I have been part of an organization called the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. It has a website with a fantastic resources page. Churches for Middle East Peace, CMEP, has fantastic resources. And then, there's no limit to the number of voices out there that are waiting for you if you want to get educated, if you want to get outside of the sort of the three sources that you continually go to. If you want a critique of Christian Zionism, the most robust available right now is by David Crump, who wrote Like Birds in a Cage. He also has a chapter in our book. Um, and so David Crump, Like Birds in a Cage, is, you know, to this day, the best challenge to the essential tenets of Christian Zionism. If you want to take a look seriously at the movement, that's a good place to start. Um, I could list a lot of names. People could pause the video and jot down some names if that would be helpful. But if that's not useful, then I won't bother.
Why don't you hold up the book again? The
Okay.
Being
Yeah.
Christian After the Desolation of Gaza, which is, of course, I mean that's a play off of the Being Jewish After the Desolation of Gaza. Yeah, if you're listening to this and you want to learn more, go get Bruce's edited volume, Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza. And I appreciate you guys for sending me a copy.
Yeah,
It's fascinating work with a lot of different stuff, and I saw the chapter on Christianity today as well. It's
yeah.
that one hurt. Um, but thank
Just,
you.
just a tag on one of the things you said. So Peter Beinart is a Orthodox practicing Jew out of New York City, who was born in South Africa but is based in New York, and teaches journalism and writes a lot and gets a lot of, you know, opportunities to write and speak. And he wrote a book. It's not quite. It's called "Being Jewish After." I want to say the destruction of Gaza, a reckoning, and that came out in January, almost a year ago. And we've interviewed him. He endorsed our book. And when I saw that book and first came out, like we were still trying to come up with a title for ours, you know. And I had like 10 listed titles, like, oh, would this work? Would that work? And at the end of the day, I thought, you know what? He's calling his community, his tribe, fellow Jews, to rethink Judaism in light of what Israel is doing in Gaza. That's what we're doing. But we're calling our Christian tribe to rethink how to be Christian after what's happened in Gaza. And so I was kind of honoring, and in the introduction, we talk about Peter, and in the conclusion, Ross Wagner talks about Peter Beinart's book. And we both are kind of, nodding to him as somebody who's taking that bold step to say to his people, hey, this is idolatry, what we're doing. We've got to rethink it. And that's the same kind of message that, obviously in a different way, we're offering and pushing to our community. Will either one make a difference? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, since you brought that up, and maybe this will be the last question to end on.
Yeah.
Uh, I appreciate you've already spent a lot of your time, and I appreciate you blessing us with this. But I mean, in Bernard's book, a huge part of the question is the Jewish community, and he talks about how the label of anti-Semitism and connecting that to anti-Zionism has meant that any criticism of Israel has been dismissed as anti-Semitic. Um, and on the one hand, I think that's a very effective weaponization of anti-Semitism to avoid any critique of Israel, and I think it's been used to avoid having this conversation. On the other hand, part of me is a little concerned that there'll be this counterswing over the coming decades and centuries because of what has happened. And I'm just wondering. Obviously, I think we have to be able to critique Israel without critiquing Jews en masse. But how do we strategically do that so that we don't just lead to a counter thing that then plays out over the coming decades and centuries in an anti-Semitic way? Like, how do we?
Yeah.
I think that we can do it. How do we do that?
Yeah, and I don't know that it will happen. I think, I don't necessarily trust all the figures and data about the surge in anti-Semitic behavior. Some of it's for real, on the rise. Um, but Israel has has worked hard over the years to blur the line between Jews and Israel. It's not just some random anti-Semite white nationalist that's blurring the line. Israel has wanted to blur the line between Jews and Israel. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And so Israel wants all Jews to see Israel as their state. And the argument is you're more safe because Israel exists, so you should support us, right? So it's not entirely surprising that other people who are less informed are making that same conflation, and that's a horrible conflation that Peter Beinart resists, that I resist, but that is somewhat inevitable, in part given what Israel has done to blur the line, and now what Israel is doing. Uh, I would want to say here's the argument, right, from we'll say the pro-Israel side. They want to say, listen, Israel is necessary to keep Jews safe. Um, it's a Jewish state with an army, with laws in place. So Jews have been thrown out of so many countries and mistreated because of anti-Semitism over the centuries. So we finally got our own place. And we're finally able to keep ourselves safe. We're not going to depend on any of you guys anymore. We got our issues. So if you oppose a Jewish state, you are threatening Jewish safety. So that's the logic, right? And you can sort of see, if you try to climb inside that, you can sort of make sense of it. That a challenge to the Jewish state is a challenge to the Jewish protection, the state's protection over the Jewish people. Now, Peter Beinart and others would say, including me, that Israel's behavior is not making Jews more safe. So if you really want to make Jews more safe, you're going to change your behavior, and you're going to stop, insisting on a military occupation of other people under your control, because that's never going to turn, the place into a safe haven. More than half the Jews in the world do not live in Israel today. Well, why are they not in Israel? Well, they must feel somewhat safe where they are. Maybe they have a backup plan. I can always go to Israel, but they're fine in New York, apparently. So they don't necessarily see today that they need protection from the Jewish state. But the main point I'm making is that they are that Israel itself, through its own actions, is creating an unsafe place for Jews. So what I would call for, what Peter Beinart would call for, and maybe in different ways, is that we collectively say, listen, Israel, we want to help you, or we want to challenge you or push you to change your behavior towards your neighbors, toward the non-Jews under your dominion, because that's what's going to ultimately bring lasting peace. People rise up in some kind of resistance or militant, uprisings when they are oppressed, when they feel enfranchised, when they've got the vote, when they've got political enfranchisement, they are much less inclined to rise up. They want a good school for their kids. They want a job. They want to be able to move around. They got life to live. They're not interested in fomenting rebellion if they feel enfranchised. So that's the call. And I don't think any of what I've just said counts as anti-Semitism. That's the unfortunate thing. Since the 1970s, anti-Zionism has been called the so-called new anti-Semitism. And this is the idea that if you're opposed to Zionism, you're anti-Semitic. What are you opposed to? You're opposed to a state that privileges Jews over non-Jews. I'm opposed to a Muslim state. I'm opposed to a Christian state, and I'm opposed to a Jewish state. I'm not anti-Christian. I just don't want a state in which Christians have rights that non-Christians don't have. That's, don't ask me to sign up for a Christian nationalist America. I'm not interested. I don't want to sign
I'm
up for.
Canadian, so I'm on board.
I'm Canadian too. Well, I have both now. So
Oh, really?
we're yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to
So
interrupt
yeah,
you.
no. So anyway, as part of that, anti-Semitic, can that be called anti-Semitism? Some will probably find a way. If you ask me, does Israel have a right to exist? My first answer is, well, that's a made-up right. No state has a right to exist. It's a fiction. There's no such thing in international law. States either exist or they don't. But apart from that, I want to say, what Israel are you talking about? Are you asking me, does Israel have a right to exist as a racially discriminatory state? Is that what you're asking me? In other words, the Israel that exists today in terms of its regime, its laws, its policies, if that's what you're asking, then I'm not going to sign up for that. So what do you mean by, if now I'm saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, it's not saying that Jews shouldn't be in the land. It's saying Jews should be calling their own government to change their policies, and they need to do so urgently.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fisk, for blessing us with your time today. The book is Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza. So check that out. Some really interesting articles in there. And as Dr. Fisk said, one of the very first things you can do is educate yourself on this issue. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, Dr. Fisk. I appreciate you and your work.
You interview well, so thanks for the chance to be in conversation.
Yeah, lovely to have you.